It was the Christmas season once again. The air was filled with excitement as James and his family prepared for their annual trip to the village. This tradition had become the highlight of the year, especially for their 3 children, who looked forward to the journey with uncontainable glee. It was the only time they got to visit the village, where they enjoyed the freedom of playing with their cousins and basking in the friendly, welcoming weather. The preparations for the trip were in full swing, with the house buzzing with activity. Uche, James's diligent wife, meticulously packed their belongings, carefully checking every item to ensure nothing important was left behind. Her hands moved swiftly, folding clothes and tucking away essentials while mentally running through a checklist. The children, unable to contain their excitement, danced around her, their laughter and animated chatter creating an atmosphere of joy. They peppered her with questions about the trip, their eyes shining with anticipation. James had a peculiar habit. He did not value prayer, a trait that had long been a source of quiet frustration for Uche. Whenever she reminded him of the importance of seeking divine guidance, he would shrug nonchalantly, wave her off, or occasionally offer a dry comment about being too busy. His indifference, though disheartening, no longer surprised her. Over the years, Uche had learned to accept that James's faith was lukewarm at best. She remained steadfast in her own beliefs, often gathering their 3 children in the living room to pray without him. Together, they would kneel, heads bowed, committing their lives and plans into God's hands. Despite James's absence during these moments, Uche's faith remained unshaken. This year was no different. As they prepared for the journey ahead, Uche once again led her children in prayer, quietly hoping that James's heart might one day soften to the power of prayer. With just 3 days left before Christmas, the family's preparations intensified. Bags were packed, gifts for relatives were arranged, and the children's excitement reached a fever pitch. But James's indifference toward prayer remained steadfast. One chilly evening, while driving home from his office, James noticed a frail old woman standing by the roadside under the fading streetlights. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth and waved hesitantly for a ride. Something about her fragile appearance tugged at his conscience, and he pulled over, rolling down the window. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Just the next street," she replied, her voice soft but steady. James nodded and unlocked the door. "Hop in." As the car hummed along the quiet road, the old woman turned to him, her eyes glinting with an unusual intensity. "Young man, as you prepare to travel for Christmas, make sure you pray very well. I see trouble ahead." James raised an eyebrow and chuckled lightly. "This isn't my first time traveling for the holidays. Why should this trip be any different?" Her face grew grave, her tone firm. "Do not take my words lightly. Prayer is essential. Without it, you may find yourself in unforeseen danger." Her words lingered in the air, but James dismissed them with a wry smile, chalking it up to the ramblings of an overly superstitious elder. As they reached her destination, the woman repeated her warning. "Pray very well. Trouble looms for the unprepared." "Noted," James muttered dryly, eager to be on his way. She stepped out of the car, her small frame disappearing into the night. James watched her go, shaking his head as he murmured, "Some people always have to sound ominous." With a dismissive wave of his hand, he drove off, pushing her unsettling words to the back of his mind. Little did he know, the old woman's cryptic warning would soon take on a significance he could not ignore. Unbeknownst to James, back in the village, his stepmother, Mama Uche, nursed a simmering resentment toward him and his family. Every Christmas, their arrival in a sleek, polished car stirred envy in her heart. Uche would step out in her elegant dresses, the children laughing and playing in their fine clothes, while James carried himself with an air of confidence and success. In stark contrast, Mama Uche's children, burdened by life struggles, would arrive on rickety bicycles, their clothes faded and patched, their spirits weighed down by hardship. Each year, the comparison gnawed at her, but this year, something shifted. Watching her children struggle while James and his family basked in admiration and comfort felt unbearable. As the festive season approached, Mama Uche decided she had endured enough. Her resentment festered, growing into a resolve to take action and disrupt James's seemingly perfect life, no matter the cost. Late one night, unable to contain the bitterness boiling within her, Mama Uche confided in her closest friend, Uche, who had long been known for dabbling in dubious solutions to life's problems. As Mama Uche poured out her frustrations, Uche listened intently, her face a mask of both sympathy and intrigue. Finally, she leaned closer and whispered, "If you truly want to put an end to this, there's a powerful coven deep in the forest. They can help you." Mama Uche hesitated, but the thought of another Christmas filled with humiliation tipped the scales. "Take me there," she said, her voice resolute. The following evening, cloaked in secrecy, the two women made their way to the coven. The atmosphere inside was heavy, the air thick with the smell of burning herbs. The coven leader, a commanding figure with piercing eyes, regarded Mama Uche with an unsettling calm. "What do you seek?" she asked, her voice cold and measured. Mama Uche clenched her fists. "I want to stop my stepson, James, and his family from coming to the village this Christmas. I want them gone, forever." The leader's eyes narrowed as she scrutinized Mama Uche. "What has he done to deserve this?" "He is too proud," Mama Uche snapped. "Every Christmas, he parades his wealth while my children are left to wallow in shame." The leader's expression darkened. "You must understand the cost of such a request. If this mission fails, the consequences will rebound onto you and your children." For a moment, doubt flickered across Mama Uche's face, but her envy quickly snuffed it out. "I don't care. Do it," she said firmly. The coven set to work, chanting incantations and performing dark rituals under the moonlit sky. As the final act concluded, the leader turned to her. "It is done," she said with an air of finality. Mama Uche left the coven that night, convinced that her stepson's reign of superiority was about to end. She had no idea the forces she had unleashed would have repercussions far beyond her control. Meanwhile, in the bustling city, the family's preparations for their journey were nearing completion. The house was filled with the lively chatter of children, the rustling of suitcases, and the occasional hum of a Christmas carol playing softly in the background. On Christmas Eve, after a long day of packing and last-minute errands, Uche stood in their bedroom, watching James as he prepared for bed. Summoning her courage, she approached him once again. "James," she said gently, "I think we should pray tonight, as a family, for a safe trip tomorrow." James barely looked up, his tone dismissive. "You pray. I'm too tired for all that." Her heart sank, but she chose not to argue. Left with no other option, Uche gathered the children in the living room. Kneeling together, they prayed fervently. Her voice trembled with urgency as she asked God for protection, placing their journey entirely in his hands. The following morning, the much-anticipated day of the journey, the house was alive with excitement. Uche hurried about, ensuring every bag was accounted for, while the children buzzed with energy, chattering endlessly about their plans for the village, seeing their grandparents, playing with cousins, and enjoying the festivities. The air was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of breakfast lingering from the kitchen. As James prepared to leave, Uche made one last attempt to persuade him. "James, please," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "let us commit this journey to God. It's important." James waved her off, already halfway out the door. "You can pray if you want. I have more important things to do," he muttered, heading toward the car. Her heart heavy with concern, Uche gathered the children in the living room. Kneeling together, they prayed earnestly, their voices united as they committed the journey to God's hands. Uche's words carried a fervent urgency, her faith unwavering despite James's indifference. Outside, James was met with unexpected trouble. Sliding into the driver's seat, he turned the ignition, but the car refused to start. The engine sputtered and groaned, each attempt more futile than the last. Frustrated, he popped the bonnet and began tinkering with the engine, muttering under his breath. Despite his efforts, the car remained stubbornly silent. Unable to resolve the issue, James called a mechanic. After a brief inspection, the mechanic delivered the grim news. "Boss, the engine is completely knocked. You'll need to replace it." James's frustration boiled over. "Today of all days," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. With no other option, the family quickly regrouped. Hauling their luggage to the nearby bus park, they boarded a crowded bus bound for the village. As the bus slowly filled with passengers, Uche could feel the tension between herself and James. The hustle and bustle of the crowd didn't faze her, but she was determined to commit the journey to God in prayer. She stood up in the bus, her voice clear and unwavering as she began to pray aloud. "Father, we commit this journey into your hands. Protect us and keep us safe," she prayed fervently. James shot her a glare, clearly embarrassed by her public display of faith. "You're disturbing everyone," he hissed under his breath, his face flushed with irritation. But Uche was undeterred. Ignoring his harsh words, she continued her prayer with even more conviction. Some of the nearby passengers were in agreement with the prayer by saying, "Amen," while others chose to remain silent, pretending not to notice. The bus began to move, but Uche's prayers filled the space, a quiet strength in the midst of the journey. The bus had barely covered half the distance when a sudden shout from the driver sent a jolt of panic through everyone on board. "The brakes! "They're not working," he yelled, his voice tinged with fear. Instantly, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed, clutching anything they could as the bus careened uncontrollably down the road. The driver fought desperately with the steering wheel, but the bus swerved violently, unable to slow down. Uche, her heart pounding, instinctively pulled her children close, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Lord, protect us," she whispered over and over, her hands gripping them tightly. The bus continued to veer off course, and in an instant, it collided with a parked truck. The sound of metal smashing against metal was deafening. The impact was catastrophic. The bus crumpled, the force of the collision sending a wave of dust and debris into the air. Witnesses rushed to the scene, expecting the worst. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. Uche and her children emerged shaken but unscathed, their bodies battered but alive. However, James was not as fortunate. His leg had been caught in the wreckage, severely injured and requiring immediate medical attention. As the chaos settled into an eerie silence, Uche's prayers intensified, her faith a lifeline in the midst of calamity. News of the accident spread quickly, reaching the village like wildfire. Mama Uche, upon hearing the shocking news, burst into tears of what she believed were tears of triumph. Her heart swelled with relief, convinced that her plan had succeeded. She had thought her bitterness and resentment toward James and his family would finally pay off. Little did she know, her dark intentions had been thwarted by Uche's unshakable faith and fervent prayers. Meanwhile, at the hospital, James lay in a bed, recovering from his injuries. The pain in his leg was intense, but his mind was preoccupied with something else. He had not expected this turn of events, and it left him unsettled. That's when the old woman, the one he had picked up the day before, appeared at his bedside. "Do you recognize me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. James shook his head weakly, still groggy from the pain and medication. "I warned you to pray," she said, her eyes locking with his in a way that sent a chill down his spine. "Your wife's prayers saved your family. Never underestimate the power of prayer." Her words were like a sharp reminder, cutting through his arrogance and pride. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, offering a short prayer for his recovery before standing to leave. As she walked away, her words echoed in his mind, lingering with a force he could not ignore. Something inside James began to shift. The seeds of change had been sown. After weeks of treatment, James was finally discharged from the hospital, and the family made their way back to the city. The traumatic experience had shaken him to his core, and he returned home with a newfound sense of humility. From that day forward, James was a man transformed. He never missed an opportunity to pray, often gathering his family for devotions, making sure that they all committed their lives and plans to God. It was a stark contrast to the man he had been before, proud, indifferent, and dismissive of faith. Meanwhile, back in the village, Mama Uche's fate took a dark turn. She fell gravely ill, racked with excruciating pain. Alone in her room, she began to scream uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the quiet village. In her agony, she was consumed by guilt, and through her sobs, she confessed her sins aloud. "I tried to kill James and his family. Forgive me," she wailed. Her desperate cries reverberated through the village, but by morning, Mama Uche was dead. Her life had been consumed by the very bitterness she had tried to use against others. James and his family, now united in faith, continued to thrive. The ordeal had taught them the importance of prayer, the power of God's protection, and the deep peace that comes with unwavering faith. They lived happily ever after, never again taking their blessings for granted, always remembering the lesson they had learned. Merry Christmas to you all. Thank you for your unwavering support. Wishing you peace, joy, and countless blessings this festive season.